Hello folks, I've already given my thoughts on the more expensive Ordro cameras out there. This includes the AZ50, the AC3, and AC5. I've reviewed each one separately, and I even have a video comparing the most expensive one, the AZ50, to some cheap point-and-shoot cameras. I have explicitly recommended against those Ordro cameras, and that goes for the several other brands that they come as well. But what about an Ordro camera that only costs $50? If someone just wants something super cheap that can record some video, it wouldn't take much to be a good value at $50. I was searching to see if I could find a camera that I could recommend in the super cheap category. I happened upon this Ordro HDV-V12 for $50 on Amazon. So could this be the first Ordro camera that I would actually recommend for the price? For $50, it doesn't have a very high benchmark to meet. Build quality is what I would expect for $50. It feels pretty cheap, and the fit and finish is not great. The worst issue is the zoom rocker, which wobbles and flops around and gives an impression that it probably won't work right, and it doesn't. It often requires messing with the rocker and holding it just right to get it to zoom back out. The display works, but it has a few stuck pixels. The camera does come as a complete package with 2 batteries and an SD card, so that's good for $50. The USB connection on the camera that is used for connecting to a computer and for charging the batteries is a non-standard USB connection. So even if you have a few USB cables of various types lying around, you aren't going to have a spare for this one, and you'll likely have difficulty finding one for sale if the included one gets lost or broken. I would much prefer to see it use a standard mini or micro USB connector. The camera does feel suspiciously heavy, so I'll be taking it apart in a bit. The menu closes completely every time you select an option, so you have to reopen the menu if you want to make a second change. As with all the Ordro cameras I've tested, the anti-shake mode does nothing. I've tried with it on and off, and I've never been able to detect even a tiny difference, either when taking pictures or videos. There is a face detection mode on this camera, which also does nothing. The camera is advertised as having smile capture, says so right on the camera, but no such option exists in the menu, and it certainly doesn't take a picture or start video or anything like that when a subject smiles. There's also a beauty face option, and I haven't been able to tell that that does anything at all either. Opening and closing the display does not turn the camera on and off. The only thing that turns it on and off is the power button in here, so that's just something you'll have to keep in mind. I don't really mind that. I'm totally fine with being able to just turn the camera on and off manually with the button here, but if you're used to any other kind of camcorder, you're going to have to get in the habit of turning it off before you flip this closed, otherwise it's going to stay on and the battery's going to die. The lens has a fixed focus with a minimum focus distance of 3 or 4 feet, which limits how close you can get to your subject and still be in proper focus. The piece of plastic, and yes, I did confirm that it is plastic, that is over the lens here, it has no anti-reflective coating, so there are obvious and distracting reflections. Photos can be taken anywhere from 0.3 to 20 megapixels. The 0.3 megapixel setting does look a tiny bit lower resolution than the next step up, but from there they all look exactly the same, and they all look worse than what you'd get from a 10-year-old phone camera. The digital zoom is painfully slow, and as mentioned before, the zoom rocker is pretty flaky. The camera supposedly records at 1920 by 1080p at 30 frames per second, as well as a couple lower resolutions. It also has an IR night vision mode, which is impressive for a $50 camera. But it's not quite as impressive as it first sounds. Despite being advertised as 30 frames per second when in 1920 by 1080 resolution and having the settings show up as 1080p 30 frames per second in the menu, the 1080p mode actually records at 15 frames per second. It also stutters almost continuously, and any movement or panning dramatically blurs the image, even in bright sunlight. It seems like it has a very low shutter speed, and it only gets even worse when the light drops. Combine that with bad rolling shutter, and this camera simply isn't very good for recording even slight subject or camera movement when set to 1080p. Whatever processor is actually being used isn't up to the task for 1080p. Detail isn't terrible, but it's not great, and the image quality degrades so much with any movement. It's even worse in IR mode. Any movement at all blurs the image almost beyond recognition. In fact, IR mode is pretty much useless in 1080p mode because the shutter speed is so slow. In low light, the IR mode may be a tiny bit brighter than video from a standard point-and-shoot camera that doesn't have IR mode or a built-in light, but unless you're in a very small space where the built-in light in this camera helps, it's really not going to record anywhere near total darkness. In my experience, IR mode is no brighter than what I can see with my naked eye. Recording at the 720p resolution setting results in much smoother video. It's not perfect, but it is usable. Unfortunately, it is nowhere near 720p resolution. I estimate closer to 144p. Maybe 240p, but that would be at the very most, and I don't even think it's that high. It is well below 480p resolution. It's really low resolution with visible pixelation even when viewed on a tiny screen or in a tiny window on a computer monitor. Audio is mono and is recorded at 16 kilohertz, so it's not going to capture a very wide frequency range. It sounds flat and muffled. It's also very quiet, even when I'm talking right next to the camera, so it's not going to give very good audio in almost any situation. And here's a quick sample of the audio from this camera. I am talking with my mouth only about 4 or 5 inches away from the input hole of the microphone, so I'm in my sound booth here, so the audio is really never going to be any better than this. On the plus side, the audio doesn't seem to skip and stutter like the video does. And with that, let's take it apart and see if we can figure out why it's as heavy as it is. It seems the tripod mount is just a little plastic insert that screws in on the bottom. One interesting thing to note, probably can't really see it there. I don't know if I can make this bright enough that you can see, but there is a screw down in this hole, and this hole, but there is no screw in that hole, so it doesn't seem like a screw was ever actually put there. Well, let me do a little bit more investigating for more screws, and we'll be back. Yep, there was one hiding underneath the label. Yep, and there it is. The Ordro signature. A big block of cast iron inside the camera to make it feel heavier. I had my strong suspicions that this camera was going to have a block of metal in it too, and it has its own specially cast one. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that out so we can get a little bit better idea of just how big that is. And there we go. That is a pretty large block of metal. And that is what was accounting for this camera not feeling like a super lightweight nothing. Block of metal. And there you have it. I thought it was suspiciously heavy, and I was right to be suspicious. This now seems to be Ordro's calling card. A block of metal inside the camera. In the end, I would not recommend this camera. Yes, it is only $50, and you can't expect much for that price, but you can get better for $50. Here's a clip from the Ordro HDV-V12, side by side with some video I recorded simultaneously with a $40 Dragon Touch action camera. I had both cameras set to 1080p, though the Dragon Touch can do 4K. But in fairness, it doesn't improve the detail all that much. I had hoped that this Ordro would finally be a super inexpensive camcorder that I could say was good for someone who just wanted the cheapest camcorder they could get. But the video from this camera is just horrible. Even with bad 1080p, if the 720p was okay, I could probably still have recommended it, but the 720p on this camera is more like 144p, and it still isn't all that smooth. You may not expect much out of a camera that costs $50 or less, but this Ordro fails to meet even the meager $50 standard that it sets for itself. And like all the other Ordros, it's full of features that do nothing, it has advertised features that don't exist, and it's got just a block of metal in it to make it feel like higher quality than it is. So this is a definite non-recommend. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Take care.